Great clinical research professionals aren't born, they're built. In each episode, hear from leading experts in clinical trial management as they inspire and motivate you to become an effective leader. Welcome to the Clinical Trial Podcast. Here to help you accelerate your career is your host, Kunal Sampat.
Hi, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Clinical Trial Podcast. I'm your host, Kunal Sampat, where my job is to help you accelerate your clinical research career. This is a special episode on risk management. It is important to understand what dictates the work we do as clinical research professionals and how our work fits into the bigger picture of medical product development. This episode serves exactly that purpose. You'll be introduced to ISO 14971, application of risk management to medical devices, and learn about its relationship to ISO 14155, clinical investigation of medical devices for human subjects, good clinical practice. You'll also learn about key terminology around risks, how to define risks, what's special about clinical studies with respect to risk management, and much more. Our guest today is Bijan Elahi. Bijan has worked in risk management for medical devices for over 29 years at the largest medical device companies in the world, as well as small startups. He is a technical fellow and Medtronic corporate advisor on safety risk management of medical devices. In this capacity, he offers education and consulting on risk management to all Medtronic business units worldwide. Bijan is a lecturer at the Eindhoven University of Technology in Netherlands, where he teaches risk management to doctoral students in engineering. At the invitation of FDA, he also teaches a graduate course on medical device risk management at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Bijan is the founder of MedTech Safety Inc., an education and advisory company. He has educated over 6,500 individuals worldwide. Bijan is frequently invited speaker at international professional conferences and is also a contributor to ISO 14971, the international standard on application of risk management to medical devices. Last but not least, he is the author of Safety Risk Management for Medical Devices, published by Elsevier Publishing. Please join me in welcoming Bijan on the show. Bijan, thank you so much for joining me today on the Clinical Trial Podcast. I'm really excited to have you on the show. I love to, expose or introduce new topics to the listeners, and I think some of the work you've done with risk management for medical devices and your book, I think, is going to play a huge influence on the work that we do today and in years to come. So thank you so much for accepting my invite and joining me today.
My pleasure.
So, I think a great place to start, I think I mentioned the book, you've written this book on safety risk management for medical devices. What role does this book and the work you do impact? How does it impact medical product development? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Medical devices have to be approved by regulatory agencies before they can be commercialized. This is in every country that is regulated. So US, Canada, Europe, and most of the world. All the agencies expect you to show that the benefits of the device outweigh its risks. And the discipline of risk management identifies the risks and evaluates them and controls them and then compares them against the benefits. So it is an absolutely necessary thing to do. There's no way around it. And this book helped demystify this discipline of risk management because for most people, risk management appears to be a mysterious or unclear or maybe even confusing subject. And the reason for that usually is because they just don't have prior exposure to it and they don't do it very often. So from the outside, it just seems a little daunting. And my intention for this book was to make it simple, easy to understand, and especially easy to explain. Because sometimes people who do risk management, maybe they have some degree of understanding so they can do the work, but they don't know enough to be able to explain it. And when you are submitting your medical device for approval, a regulatory agency needs to also understand what did you do. So if you can't explain it, still is not good. So that's the point of this book.
That's great. Yeah, and I'll link that in the show notes for those that are looking to read the book and learn more. So, what prompts risk management in clinical studies?
Clinical studies have an intention of studying some kind of a medical device for its risks and benefits. ISO 14155 requires that the principles of risk management be applied both during the planning and the conduct of the clinical studies to make sure that the data that is generated is useful and appropriate and safe, and also the subjects themselves are safe and they don't get injured during the study.
Mm-hmm.
So risk management is a requirement by the standard ISO 14155, and both standards ISO 14155 and ISO 14971 are highly intertwined. They pass information back and forth between them.
Right. So I know you mentioned the two ISO standards. Before we kind of dig deeper into those two, does compliance with the standard automatically mean that you're complying with the regulation, or is there like a difference between the standard and the regulation?
Right. Our obligation to the regulatory agencies is to meet the law, the regulations. So in the United States, that's 21 CFR Part 820. So that's Code of Federal Regulation Part 820, which is the regulation for the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And in Europe, we have a different one called MDR, Medical Device Regulation, or also IVDR, Device Regulation.
Mm-hmm.
In order to meet the requirements of these regulations, which is to show that in America, to show that the devices are safe and effective, and in Europe to meet the general safety and performance requirements in the regulations, the best and easiest way is to conform to a recognized or a harmonized standard. And these are key words. Recognized in America is the FDA says we recognize the standard. In the United States, the FDA recognizes ISO 14971 2019,
Mm-hmm.
which is the third edition. And in Europe, there is a harmonized version of the standard that's called EN ISO 14971 2019 plus A11 2021. Kind of a mouthful, but that's a harmonized version of 2019 version of the standard, which is recognized by the European Union. So in both cases, both Europe and US, conformance to ISO 14971 will confer a presumption of conformity with the safety and performance requirements that both regulations expect.
Sure.
And it's a kind of a long answer, but yes, in a kind of a, it's because this is legal matter. So in a kind of a roundabout way, I'm saying that if you conform to ISO 14971, it is presumed that you're meeting the requirements of the regulations.
Mm-hmm. I see. But then what about the harmonized? Do you need to like is there a difference between the harmonized versus the non-harmonized, I guess, version of the standard?
Yeah, there is. So the 2019 version of the standard is the international standard, and the European Union compared the requirements of the regulation and added a couple of annexes to the standard. So this is that A11 is these additional the annexes. So with the addition of these additional annexes, then which is like I'd say 99% still the same thing as ISO 14971, slight difference.
Mm-hmm.
So if you for Europe, if you want to conform, if you want to get a CE mark in Europe, you have to conform to the harmonized version. But in America, this international version is sufficient.
Got it. Okay, great. So by conforming to the standard, you're basically confirming with, or not, you're in conformance with the law or compliance with the law.
Yes. Yeah.
In America for this particular standard. I see. That's great. Thanks for explaining that.
Sure. It's also the law in Europe, but in Europe it's called MDR or IVDR. It's a different law.
So I want to maybe talk a little bit about, since one of the core themes for this episode, we're going to talk about risk management for clinical investigators. So I wanted to maybe understand a little bit how does an investigator with no background in risk management go about thinking about risks? Like how do you get them to understand this? Because in my experience, I think there's a lot of physicians that already struggle enough with doing clinical trials, let alone now we're talking about this kind of a much more deeper part of clinical trial management, which is risk management. So, what are your recommendations or thoughts on like how do we train and educate investigators on risk management?
Well, ISO 14155 has specific requirements for risk management. In section 2, it makes a normative reference. Specifically, it says we are making a normative reference to ISO 14971. So if you're going to conform to 14155, you have to also conform to 14971, and then so you have to become trained in ISO 14971 of how does it work. In practice, what I see is a lot of clinical investigators rely on experts in medical device risk management to do that part for them and then also support them because the focus and expertise of clinical investigators is not so much risk management, it's about doing clinical investigations, but they have to do this. So my recommendation is to take at least for clinical investigators to take at least a basic training on ISO 14971.
Okay.
So they understand the language and the methodology, and then stay in close contact and cooperation with the risk managers for the medical devices that they intend to use.
Right. So for those listening, the ISO 14971 is the application of risk management to medical devices. That's the name of the standard as a whole. I'll link it in the show notes. So, Bijan, I think my follow-up question to that would be, for some reason, I just assumed that the 14971 would apply to manufacturers and not necessarily like doctors or investigators. How does if they're not manufacturing the device, then what's the rationale for them to or like what's the why does the regulatory body think this is important for them to understand this standard or be trained on this standard?
If you're not manufacturing, so you're asking if a clinical investigator is not a manufacturer, why should they understand 14971?
That's right.
Well, as I mentioned, 14155 makes a normative reference to 14971. A normative reference means that the two standards become one package. So then whether you like it or not, you have to conform to 14971, and so you have to understand it, at least understand it.
Okay.
Of course, I said, it would be great if you could become an expert as well, but then a clinical investigator's focus is not risk management, so it would be good to get a team partnership with somebody who is an expert in 14971. But then, as I said, I think clinical investigators should have the fundamental training in 14971 so that when they work with the experts in medical device risk management, they can speak the same language at least. They can understand what they're talking about.
Sure. That's great. And I think it's also beneficial for investigators that are doing investigator initiated trials where they're kind of on their own. Like they just get the devices from the sponsor, or they may be like building devices in their lab. Just in their center, they create a medical device and it's really not coming from the outside. Like I've been on projects where the investigator kind of had their own little lab and they made this device for their patients. So I think understanding this standard would help them greatly. So I can see that now that we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, in those contexts, when the device is not a commercially approved device, it's an experimental device that they just maybe make a few samples in their own lab and they want to try it out. Yeah, still you have to do risk management. So that case, they have more to do because then in a commercially approved device, the manufacturer has already done the risk management of the device, so you can leverage that. But in the case of an experimental device, then you have to do it yourself. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. That's right. So, more the top like 3 or 5 risks that clinical investigators face, that you kind of see in your like when you're working with them or are training them and so on, from based on the standard and things that they don't think of.
Well, one of the things that I think clinical investigators need to keep in mind is that there are two types of risks that affect their subjects. One is the risk from the device, and the other one is the risk from the study. So the risks of the device, assuming that you're talking about a commercially available device, have been managed already by the manufacturer of the device. So there should be a risk management file and a risk management report. Now take that and bring it to a clinical investigation. Now you have the study, performance of the study on the subjects, especially if you're going to depart from the intended use of the device. Now you are going to introduce potentially new risks that were not anticipated by the manufacturer. You're doing something new with the device.
Right.
And also the execution of the study, like maybe if you're going to take blood samples, if you're going to x-ray the patients, you're doing additional things to the patient that also add to the risk. Separate from that, there's also risks from the study execution and data handling. Now, that's not so much the risk to the body of the patient, but if you create faulty data, that would create faulty conclusions. So that itself could create indirect hazards. So you can see now there's the different aspects of risk.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, that's very interesting. So basically, like investigators may think about risk of the device or the risk to the patients, but like kind of thinking about them like together. And there's so many different little pieces to each of those.
Right.
Yeah. And like, yeah, do you feel like investigators should like pay more attention to devices like from startup companies that, startup companies will just reach out to the investigator and say, hey, I want to do a clinical trial with this device. And the investigator, I don't know if they ever ask the question. It's like, is your is your manufacturing or your product like in compliance with the 14971? Like, I don't know if people ask that question.
Yeah, maybe they don't. I don't know, but they should, because one way or another, if you're going to a clinical investigation that is compliant with ISO 14155, there is no way around it. You have to also conform to ISO 14971. So if you're talking about maybe a manufacturer who's maybe starting out, a startup company, they haven't done any risk management and they just want to do a clinical study, well, they are still subject to these two standards, 14155 and 14971. And
right.
Maybe in that case, the clinical investigator should ask the manufacturer, what do you have as far as risk management of your device? And if the manufacturer says, I don't have anything, well, they say, well, let's roll up our sleeves and do it. Let's do the risk analysis of this device before we start investigating and using it on real patients.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, this is like new this is all like new for me also. So I'm learning like so much from you. So thank you for sharing all this.
Yeah,
so,
pleasure.
What can investigators do to mitigate some of these risks? Obviously we talked about doing the training. Is there any other thing that they could do to kind of stay ahead of the curve, in terms of educating themselves and kind of being on the lookout?
Yeah, I think an investigator who has at least some fundamental training in risk management will be able to at least ask the right questions, right? So I imagine that an investigator would already be an expert in ISO 14155. I hope that's the correct assumption. That's their life and their domain. But because they also have to conform to 14971, they don't have prior training. I don't know. You can read my book, for example. You can take courses, and I teach a number of courses. One of the courses is just the fundamentals, just the language, the expectations of 14971. So get that understanding, and then you won't be blindsided when, for example, there are expectations in what goes into your clinical investigation documentations. For example, the IB and CI.
The CIB, the investigational plan,
clinical investigation plan,
and the consent,
informed consent, and investigators brochure. All those things they are required aspects of risk management that need to be mentioned in these documents. So then where are you going to get those pieces of information that are supposed to go into your documentation? You get it from risk management.
Right, right. So like, so maybe I think, can you maybe talk a little bit about the how? Maybe let's just use the consent as an example, the informed consent. Uh, like, how does one go about doing risk management? Or is there like a couple high level concepts that you could tell us, like, to do that? And then how does that feed into the consent form and so on?
Are you asking like what?
Does that question even make sense?
Kind of. Are you saying what goes into the informed consent from risk management? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, like from risk management. Yeah, exactly. And then how do you go about doing that piece of the risk management? Like maybe, yeah, that's kind of my question. So let's use an example of a trial where, a physician is kind of doing an investigator initiated trial. They're trying to use a novel device, and they don't know all the risks, and they kind of want to do a good job of having a robust consent form for their patients that kind of helps them understand, like, hey, there's a 0.1% chance that you might die from this trial or something along those lines. How do you come up with that statistic from, like, if there's not much literature out there or very little? How do you kind of do the risk management and then kind of communicate that to the patient in the consent form?
Yeah, well, it is the job of risk management to provide that information, the kind of information that is supposed
I
to
see.
go into the ICF, for example, the informed consent form, are things like the summary of the risks, what kind of contraindications, cautions, and warnings that the user should know. And if there's no prior information like from published literature, the risk management report for that device should contain this and the answers to these questions. And so this is
I see.
one of the areas that clinical investigators can rely on medical device risk management according to ISO 14971, because these are the outputs from risk management.
I see. That makes sense. And then, are there any, like, I know we talked about leveraging the medical device sponsors risk management, but what about, like, from a clinician perspective? Are there things that they can, like, are there risk management processes or tools or things that they can do to,
Do you say
feed
clinicians
that?
or
Yeah.
well, investigators?
Yeah, from a clinician. Yeah. Yeah. Our clinicians.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the risk management, we provide certain labeling information for safety, how to use the device, what kind of conditions to look out for, what are the inclusions and exclusion criteria. Maybe you can determine that this device should not be used on a person who is diabetic. So if you check,
I see.
because that would be a caution. So don't use this device on the person who has a particular condition that is not suitable for this device. That would be a way of controlling the risk.
I see.
Also, information is provided. Yeah, information is provided for handling situations. So the clinical, the IFU that comes with a medical device would have certain information and instructions. For example, if your patient experiences these symptoms, do X. It tells you how to be safe, what to do to protect the patients from harm. This information does come from risk management.
Yeah. So, there is now this new wave of medical products that are, driven by software, and, it kind of becomes unclear whether there are any risks or what other risks. Um, have you worked on projects or are aware of projects where there's, like, really no risks to the patients? Is that even happen in the real world? Or does every trial or any project always have some sort of inherent
Yeah.
or residual risk? I don't know what the correct word is for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The general consent. No, sorry. Let me start over. The general consensus is that there is no zero risk medical device.
Okay.
So every medical device has at least some degree of risk. I mean, even a tongue depressor. You can think, well, what can a tongue depressor do? Well, it could splinter and stick you in the tongue. Even the simplest device can do something to you. But maybe what you could ask is, are there any medical devices that have no benefits? Because they're medical devices. We're saying every medical device has a certain degree of risk. So that part is accepted. The consensus is that there is
Accepted.
no
Yeah.
zero risk medical device.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the question is that, well, are there some devices that have no benefits? Yeah, there could be a device that has no clinical benefit, a cosmetic device, for example.
Sure.
It may not have any clinical benefit because it's just designed to maybe, let's say a breast implant. It doesn't really make a person healthier or doesn't defeat some kind of a disease. It's just for cosmetic reasons. So you could say that there's no clinical benefit.
Right.
There are also times where the subject of a clinical study doesn't receive any direct benefit from it. Maybe they are just offering their bodies for the benefit of science so that maybe some other people would benefit, but they themselves may not directly benefit from it. Those are possible. But as far as your question is that can there be a device that has zero risk? I don't think so. I have not run across one.
Yeah, that's my question. Yeah, exactly. So I think you made an interesting point about like devices with zero benefit. So if the device has zero benefits, I guess, or that people are just doing it for the benefit of society, is that even like an ethical project or trial to be part of? Because don't the risks or the benefits need to outweigh the risks at all times? But for the patient,
right? Well, in those cases, we do benefit risk analysis. We don't look at the benefit to the patient. We look at the benefit to the society.
I see. Oh, okay.
We generally, right? We don't generally do experiment on people just for fun. Right? We do it for some scientific reason, and the scientific reason typically
some scientific question,
is either a benefit directly to that patient, and sometimes we have experimental treatments for maybe cancer. Well, the patient may have no other options left, and they say, "Well, I just want to try that. Maybe your experimental method works on me." So in that case, the patient may actually directly get a benefit. But there are times that patient will not directly get a benefit, but they are saying, well, I just like to help science so that other people could benefit, and then we look at the whole society.
Hi, friends. Thank you for listening to the Clinical Trial Podcast. And here's a brief message from our sponsor, Slope. Slope provides an online e-clinical supply chain management platform for sites and sponsors collaborating on complex, sample-intensive early-stage clinical trials. The old way of managing clinical trial supplies was using spreadsheets. The new way is leveraging a digital platform and saying goodbye to manual, spreadsheet-driven, and error-prone processes. Slope's digital platform helps mitigate clinical trial risks, manage costs, increase productivity of clinical trial collaborators, and increases subject retention. To learn more about how Slope can help you with your clinical supply management needs, visit slope.io. It's slope.io and ask to speak with a solutions coordinator today. Now back to our show. So maybe we can, I think we talked about regulations and standards. Is there a time when regulations and standards are different from each other, or are they always complementing the regulation and the standard itself?
It's kind of interesting way of asking the question. A regulation is a law, and it expects certain things. And in a very brief way of saying it, the regulation says the device should be safe and effective. That's the language of American regulations, but in Europe, it's called GSP, General Safety and Performance Requirements. Essentially the same thing. Like if you use the device for the way it was intended, it should provide some benefit and that outweigh the risks of that device. That's it, generally speaking. But how do you demonstrate that? How do you say that I can make a claim that the benefits of my device outweigh its risks?
I see.
The way to do it is to conform to ISO 14971 and apply its methods. And then the regulations say, well, we recognize ISO 14971. If you follow that, we will believe you if you make a claim that we are meeting the regulatory requirements.
I see. Mm-hmm. Thanks for explaining that nuance. When is compliance to an ISO standard required or not required? Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to understand. I think the second part of that question you are, yeah.
Yeah. So you usually need to do risk management when you want to do a clinical investigation.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some cases when you don't have to. And those are cases, for example, when you do a post-market clinical follow-up on an approved device
Mm-hmm.
used as is intended, and you're just collecting data.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you're collecting data to confirm that the IFU is correct and is properly stated. You may do a review of the data to assess the cost benefits of the device or the health outcomes, maybe sometimes for reimbursements. In those cases, you're actually not really doing anything to the patient. It's still a clinical investigation, but you're not doing it to the patient. You're just collecting data, let's say in a registry. And you're doing data mining, data analysis to make conclusions. In those cases, risk management is not required. But in most other cases, which I think what you are thinking when you think about clinical investigations, you're actually doing something to the patient. You're using a device on a patient or embedding it into a patient. In those cases, you have to do risk management.
Right, right, right. Great. Okay, that's great. Thanks for explaining that. Um, I think I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about like terminology. There's especially with the EU MDR, there's so many like new things happening in that space. Uh, can you tell, like, people talk about post-market surveillance, which is PMS, periodic safety update reports, which is the PSER, and the post-market clinical follow-up that you just mentioned. What do each of those three terms mean, and how do they fit into the larger picture of the UMDR?
EUMDR requires doing post-market surveillance, and some of the outputs of the post-market surveillance are the ones you mentioned. For example, periodic safety update report, which is PSUR. These are supposed to be produced depending on the device, on an annual or biannual basis. There is a post-market surveillance report, PMSR. It's another type of report that is produced, and PMSRs are report generally produced for class 1 devices, whereas PSURs are generated for class 2 and 3 devices. But you mentioned terminology. One of the things that I have found in the medical device industry and among also clinical investigators is a lack of clarity in the language of risk management. You will hear words such as hazards, harms, hazardous situations, where people think we are speaking the colloquial English, but we are not. These words mean specific things as defined in ISO 14971. And for example, if you see a live wire exposed, an electrical wire exposed sitting on your desk, do you think that's a hazardous situation? Well, in English, yes. In the language of risk management, no. In the language of risk management, you don't have a hazardous situation until you are exposed to the hazard. So until you touch that wire and get a shock, there is no hazardous situation. So in the colloquial English, when you have a live wire sitting in front of you on your desk, you say that this is a hazardous situation, and it makes sense when you're speaking English, but in the language of risk management, it doesn't. So this is one of those things that creates confusion in people because they think they are speaking English, but they should be speaking the jargon of the risk management.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that example. I think that will help. Yeah, I think that was very helpful. Does a lot of your work or this book that you've written, is it apply like a good percentage of it apply to like product development when things are in R&D, and then they kind of move forward? Is that how because I'm trying to think about like if somebody's trying to like start their career in R&D, I suppose like something like what you teach and share is very beneficial for them.
Yes, this book is applicable to the entire life cycle of the medical device, from concept to design and development, deployment, maintenance, and finally decommissioning and disposal. We need to take in, as medical device developers, we need to take into account the risks to people under all phases of the life cycle. A lot of times people tend to think only about the time that the device is used, but we should not forget that sometimes the disposal of the a medical device can also pose risks. Imagine if you have a device with nuclear isotopes in it, you can't just throw it in garbage.
Right.
You could, because it could cause harm to the sanitation workers, radioactivity. So we need to be careful and consider all phases of the life cycle. This is, by the way, specifically mentioned in the MDR, medical device regulation.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So that's great. So thanks for explaining that. I think I had a follow up question, but I lost the train of thought. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm going to continue with another piece of my answer to your question. You said, what about somebody who's starting, a young person starting in the medical device development? This is particularly important
Right.
because there is no training in universities when they give degrees in biomedical engineering or similar, like electrical engineering, in medical device risk management.
Right.
There are very few universities that offer that. I teach it in 3 universities, 2 in Europe and 1 in America. But of all the world, and I don't know anybody else who offers this training. So they have to learn it on the job, basically, or take courses, public courses that are available. A young engineer that's just starting out developing medical devices, they need to be aware that risk management is an absolutely necessary part of product development. And they need to self-educate or take courses if their universities did not give them this education. For example, reading my book is a good way because it's self-explanatory and easy to read, and people can self-train to some degree, and then talk to other risk managers who have done this in the past in their companies and learn from them.
Mm-hmm. I know we talked about ISO 14155 and then the 14971 and their relationship with each other. How about like the quality management system, the QMS? How does that fit into the risk management piece? Like, does the risk management kind of sit on top of the quality management system as a whole?
No, risk management
how does
is
that
part
work?
of the quality management system. It's included. So
I see.
So we create SOPs, standard operating procedures for doing risk management, and that becomes a part of the quality management system. So it's governed by ISO 13485 for example, Europeans that conform to that. And so risk management is part of the quality management system.
Yeah, great. Can you tell us a little bit about like how do you spend your day? Like, what are the things that you do? I know you said you teach, at 3 universities around the globe, literally. But maybe you can give people a glimpse into your daily life. Like, what does that look like? Like, what kind of projects do you work on? Aside from your love for writing and creating courses.
I used to be a product developer. I'm a systems engineer, so I developed medical devices, usually class 3. They were implantable pulse generators, cardiac pacemakers, defibrillators, and deep brain stimulators. But just over the past several years, I've stopped doing product development, and now I only teach. As I mentioned, I teach in 3 universities, 2 in Europe and 1 in America. I used to live in Europe, actually, and I just moved back to America last year. And since I came back, the FDA asked me to teach for the American audiences as well. So I started teaching at Drexel University, a graduate course in biomedical engineering. It's a section of it on medical device risk management. And but as far as how my day goes, basically, I live and breathe risk management. I pretty much that's all I do. I read books. I talk to experts. I write down my own thoughts and just organize them. And I teach 8 courses on risk management. Some of them are knowledge courses like lectures. For example, I mentioned one that is fundamental knowledge about medical device risk management. Some of them are skills courses. I teach, for example, how to do failure modes and effects analysis or fault tree analysis. These are techniques of analysis that support risk management. So I just, my days are pretty much always reading, thinking, writing, developing and improving my courses. I also speak in a lot of conferences. So, right now I'm being interviewed by you, but I speak at international
Sure.
conferences. And
So how does I want to also like focus a little bit about helping people with their careers in risk management. Like, what is like a great profile for somebody who's interested in risk management, but what are the things that you feel are going to be critical for their success?
Yes, for a person to be successful in risk management, I think they should have some personal characteristics, curiosity and perseverance. Curiosity so that you can, it'll motivate you to continue to learn. Perseverance basically keeps you going when it gets hard. Because risk management is not easy work, it's kind of hard work, and it takes perseverance to keep going. Those are some personal characteristics. But aside from those, there are things that you can do yourself. For example, constant learning. Risk management, like any other discipline, is constantly growing, is changing. We are learning new things. Like one of the new areas that people are spending more time on is cybersecurity. Years ago, we didn't have problems with cybersecurity. That was not an issue. 20 years ago, the cybersecurity was not a problem, but now it is, and there is a lot of work going on in figuring out, well, how do you analyze for cybersecurity threats, and how do you connect them to safety of medical devices? They're not the same thing, but they're connected. In fact, last week I attended a cybersecurity conference, and I talked to a number of experts there. The FDA was there. We were talking about how do you connect safety with cybersecurity, and this is a new area. So I'm learning myself. I'm working on that to try to figure out this novel area, and pretty much the whole world is trying to figure it out right now.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think a person would serve them well to be successful is to broaden their areas of interest, because risk management is not just one thing. It's a collaboration of a lot of disciplines. So you need to be able to speak to electrical engineers, software engineers, mechanical engineers, toxicologists, regulatory people, clinical people, legal people, so many different areas that you need to interact with. So you need to be able to speak their language. A successful risk manager is at least conversant in these other areas, if not an expert, because it's not possible to be an expert in everything, but at least know enough to be conversant and communicate, because your job as a risk management manager is to integrate all of this knowledge into a coherent and well-founded risk management risk analysis of your device.
Yeah, that's some solid advice. That's really good. Yeah, I just took my regulatory affairs exam. I don't know if I told you this when we talked the other day, but I passed it, so I'm excited.
Congratulations.
The RAC exam, but and I'm not trying to be a regulatory professional. I just want to learn about regulation so I can be a better clinical research profession, clinical research professional. So I completely see where you're coming from on this. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, I think this is one of the beauties of it, because this is what I love about my work, is that I work with so many different areas, and I love technology, and so being in touch with the designers of medical devices, the latest things, because I get to see a lot. My breadth of exposure is really wide, and so I get to see the latest thinkings about the future devices that nobody knows about yet, because I need to help these people analyze the risks of
Yeah.
their devices in advance. That's another point I can make, is that you want to start your risk management early. If you go ahead and design and build a device that is going to have safety issues, you're going to basically find yourself in a really bad situation if you finish designing the device and you just realize, I can't even sell this device because this device is unsafe. So you want to start as early as possible.
Right.
And so that's why I get to see a lot of interesting technologies early on.
Yeah. So I can't wait to ask you this question, but what was a few things you just said. So you mentioned about books you've been reading, and then you mentioned about the cybersecurity conference. Can you tell us which cybersecurity conference did you attend?
Yeah, this is internal to Medtronic, so it was not public. But yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah.
Okay. And then what about books? Like, are there any like recent books you read that you feel like, oh wow, this was awesome, that you'd like to share with us?
Well, one of the areas that I teach besides risk management, I teach critical thinking. And critical thinking is a fundamental aspect of work of engineering. So it's like how do you think? It affects everything, including risk management. How do you make proper decisions? And so yeah, I mean, I read a lot of books. There's one that it's called "Thank You for Arguing," and this is a book about that when we argue with each other. I mean, not in a fighting way, but when we challenge each other's thoughts, and
Sure.
we actually improve ourselves. All of us, we get improve ourselves. One of the one of the things that also I teach in my courses is that you need to cultivate humility and curiosity both in yourself. Humility says that you accept that the truth lies not just in you but in your whole team. You need to allow other people's thoughts to come into your mind so that you can evaluate them and use them as appropriate. And so when we argue, you basically are saying that somebody is challenging my thoughts, my theories, and I'd like to hear why, because maybe you're seeing an aspect of it that I'm not seeing. So you're actually helping me by arguing with me in a nice way. And then, of course, the curiosity says that don't assume that people will voluntarily come and tell you their thoughts, because sometimes maybe they don't want to offend you. Sometimes they may be shy. A curious person will seek and pull out other people's thoughts that are relevant to their work.
Yeah, that's some solid advice. Humility and curiosity, absolutely. They're like foundational pieces, and I think that can really accelerate your career if you kind of get them right.
Yeah. So
any other, and so thank you for arguing. So I'll check out that book. Is there and I'll link it in the show notes. Is there anything else you want to mention?
I guess one other thing I could say, I touched on that, is to make sure you're speaking the language properly. Language of risk management is not your normal English language. I can give you another example. So do you think death is a harm?
Death is a harm?
I'm asking you a question.
Is that the question?
Yeah. Do you think death is a harm?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think death is necessarily harmful. But yeah, I can tell you why I think that. But because death could happen irrespective of your medical product, I guess. I mean, like we were talking about the cancer patients example earlier.
Yeah.
And people and if they don't have any other treatment options available to them, they're going to die. So I don't think the medical product in and by itself caused harm to the patient. Or we don't know that, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I can restate it. What if a medical device did something that the patient died as a result of it? Can we say that that death was a harm from that medical device? So I can just answer the question.
I just feel like this is a trick question, so I don't want to answer it.
So in normal English, the reason I'm bringing this example is that in normal English, the answer is yes. You harm the patient. Well, we don't want to harm patients, right? So we don't want them to die from our devices. So in normal English, death would be a harm. But the language of risk management, death is not a harm, death is a consequence of a harm. It's a slight difference. So if your
I
device
see.
caused maybe an infarction in a patient, maybe you caused a stroke in a patient, like a piece of your medical device floated in their blood and they floated up to the person's brain and they caused a stroke. Uh, the stroke is the harm, and if they die from the stroke, then the death is a consequence of the harm. But death itself is not a harm in the language of risk management. So this is one of those things that trips people up because normal English, yeah, death is a harm, but in risk management, it's a
Yeah,
consequence
death
of a
is
harm.
harmful. I see. I understand now. So how does like how do you learn this stuff? Like how do you like get better at like the love language of risk management?
Well, you have to take the courses, you have to practice it, and like I give quizzes. In fact, in one of my courses, I even have a game. We play a learning game to make it more fun, and I just give them specific words and ask them to classify it, and then we discuss why is the answer is what it is. So that, and then once you do this practice a few times, you kind of get a hang of, okay, this is how I need to think about the language. And then you start speaking it correctly.
I see.
The problem with incorrect use of the language is that you waste time and you waste resources. You may address things that are
Absolutely.
not maybe a hazard. You may address some, and then you also write your reports incorrectly, and you can create confusion. People may not understand what is it that you're trying to say. So it's important to speak the language
Yeah.
properly.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's two questions, two comments to that. One is I want to maybe can you tell a little bit about like where can people learn about your courses so I can put it in the show notes also, but if you
Yeah,
could just mention
so
that
it's
so people know where to
pretty
go.
simple. If you go to my website, which is medtechsafety.com,
Okay,
medtechsafety.
great.
Yeah,
medtechsafety.com.
you'll see the list of
Great.
courses in there, and you can communicate with me.
Okay, great. I think you mentioned about learning, and I believe in like lifelong learning and all of that. I also find myself personally in situations where I'm like, I haven't learned this, and hence I just don't do that thing that I'm supposed to do. So it's like this: I need to learn, but then I don't have time to learn, and then I never get to doing the thing I need to be doing. So I find myself like a lot of times I just feel like I need to learn by doing, or yeah, do things and then learn basically in the process because people will just hide under like this wheel of like, oh, I need to learn this, and they'll never get anything done. So there's that balance is what I was trying to
Mm.
talk, share
Yeah,
basically my
yeah.
personal perspective on that. Yeah.
Doing is of course very, very important. But first you have to learn, and
Yes.
then you need to practice.
Yes.
One of the things that I
Yeah.
found is that risk management has a number of aspects to it. As I mentioned, there are some skills like failure modes and effects analysis. So people don't get to do it very often. So like can take my course, right, and they learn how to do risk
Yeah.
management. How to do failure modes and effects analysis, and maybe we even have a workshop in practice. And then they go to their jobs. Maybe they'll do it once or twice, and then maybe a year or two goes by and they don't do it again.
That's right.
During the year or two, the knowledge starts to fade. So since you brought up the word doing, I said, yeah, you need to keep doing to stay in practice because like any other knowledge, it starts to fade if you don't regularly use it. So um, I am
Yeah.
I'm fortunate in that because all I do is risk management and by thinking, teaching, that I'm constantly doing it, so it helps me to stay fresh all the time. But I also sympathize with people who um, do it maybe once a year or twice a
They don't
year.
get to do that.
They
Yeah.
don't do it enough to stay sharp and skilled.
Absolutely. That's such a good. I actually haven't, as far as I know, there's like no role in clinical research like that just says you're a risk manager. I think the only time I've seen or like a, there's a lot of discussion on risk is the the risk-based monitoring plan. People are talking about like doing the RACT, I guess. Doing you're probably more familiar with all this, but the risk-based monitoring is where people. But there's like no defined role. So I guess I don't know. Do you know, like in clinical research, if like are risk managers like part of the quality department, or have you seen like people having separate, or they're part of like I mean clinical quality, or are they part of like the big? Or yeah, go ahead.
Typically, I found that in most companies, the risk managers are part of the quality department, quality engineering, quality
Okay.
assurance, typically. But in some cases, systems engineering is also the entity that's responsible for risk management. And I can also, um, you know, I agree with you that in clinical investigation groups domain, you don't often find somebody whose title is risk manager.
That's right. Yeah.
Um, yeah, because it's not such a large focus. The large focus is to design the study, enroll people, collect data, process data. But so risk management becomes a side note for them, and they don't have anybody designed or assigned to do that. So in bigger companies, what they do is they tend to go to the risk managers in the R&D department, and they say, well, you designed this product, you know all about it, you have done the risk management, come and help us when we are doing this clinical study, support us in the risk management aspects of it. So that's how that works. If you're talking about a startup company uh, that hasn't done the risk management, they're just wanting to do a clinical investigation, then they just kind of have to do it all at once. They do the risk management, do the clinical study design and execution, do it all at once together. Um, the only thing is that you can't get away from it, Kunal. You just it's one of those things. You have to do risk
Yeah,
management.
it's integral part of yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's
I'm very
wise too.
interested in the cybersecurity. Yeah.
I mean,
Go ahead. It's what
I say it's
wise to
wise as
learn.
well. I mean, it's not
Mhm.
besides being a requirement. It's wise. I mean, we don't want to harm our patients during a clinical study. We want to understand the risks of our device, the risks of our study itself, um, both during the
Right.
study and also in follow-up phase. So
Yes. Yes. Yeah, which is why I have you on this podcast to educate people and make them aware that there is this other piece of the puzzle that people need to be aware of and understand, and just bring about more awareness.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's part of
Great. So let's see. I want to maybe, I know you mentioned about the cybersecurity. I keep coming back to that because I'm a little bit more curious about that piece. I know you mentioned that that course was like an internal program at Medtronic. Is there any that you're aware of that are like external facing programs on cybersecurity, or resources on cybersecurity for medical products?
mm. I think there are a lot, but I can't just think off the top of my head where you can go to
Okay.
get training on
Yeah,
cybersecurity.
that's fine.
Maybe just if you do a search, Google search, you'll find
Sure.
references. It's an area
Okay.
under development. What I have seen
Okay.
though is that a lot of cybersecurity work that's happening is about that. It was about cybersecurity. Um, how to do threat modeling, threat assessments, prevention of
I see.
security breaches and all that. The only thing is that because my focus is safety, I'm less interested in, for example, preventing private health information from getting exposed because maybe that's somebody's privacy. I'm more interested in preventing harm to that patient.
I see.
So cybersecurity
I
has a
see.
big interest is to just uh, prevent or be able to be resilient when a security breach has happened. What I'm interested in is that when that happens, what are the chances of harming the patient and how can I prevent that harm to the patient? So I'm looking at a small piece of it, which is why I said the two areas of cybersecurity and safety, they overlap, but they're not the same. Overlap meaning like a little bit,
The same. Yeah.
not huge overlap. They're not the same thing. They're just like a tiny overlap.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that us being like in the very, very early stages of those kind of, that kind of technology, or not even technology, just that overlap you mentioned, it doesn't exist as much right now. But I think as more devices become driven by software, I think that landscape will evolve.
True.
Is my best guess.
Yeah. And I mean, the software is continuously playing a bigger and bigger role in medical devices. And in some cases, some medical devices are only software. There's even no hardware. Uh,
That's right.
there's a
Mhm.
SAMD, or software as a medical device, is a group of medical devices that there's no hardware to them. It's just software. So yeah,
Correct.
these devices that are connected and have software, they are susceptible to security breaches, and they need to be protected. It's a requirement and expectation of regulatory agencies too now.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Great.
this
How do you keep yourself updated on? Yeah, I think you mentioned like you go to conferences and so on. But is there? How do you keep yourself updated on the most current developments in the industry? Are there like sort of newsletters you subscribe to, or are there like resources that you kind of watch out for to stay current?
Basically, I try to look for every resource that's available, every course, every seminar, every podcast, whatever that is related to medical device safety, which that takes up a lot of my time to just kind of constantly be looking for the latest information. And when you're on the
Right.
bleeding edge of knowledge, it's not so nice and tidy packaged, so you can just go like read a book and be done with it. It's bits and pieces of information
Hmm.
that are scattered in the space, in the knowledge space. And so I'm looking and gathering information. One of the podcasts that that I recommend, is by a gentleman named Naveen Agarwal, and he has weekly live discussions on Tuesdays. You can find him on LinkedIn. And so these are informal, casual conversations that we have. He selects a topic. Um, People get together and talk about this topic. And they're always nice, interesting topics, because he finds these areas that are a little bit less developed, maybe more areas that people have questions about. So we just talk about it. And because various experts come together, we get to kind of share knowledge amongst ourselves. And then also non-experts are, of course, are welcome to. They listen in and learn from our discussions.
Yeah, that's great. What was the name again? I'm sorry, I missed that.
The
What
name of
was the
the
name you
gentleman
said?
is Naveen, Naveen
Agarwal.
Agarwal,
Yeah.
and the name of
Mhm.
the program is Weekly Live Discussion Series. I can send you
Oh,
a
weekly
link
live
for
discussion
your
series.
show notes. I
Yeah,
can send you a link to his conversations.
that'd be great. That's
Yeah,
great.
he also
I would love
teaches
that.
courses in risk
Okay.
management, and so I mean, you can take courses from him too.
Oh, I see. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing. Is there anything else you'd like to share that we didn't get a chance to discuss?
I guess just the summation is that clinical investigators should be aware that risk management is necessary and is a requirement from regulations and from the standard ISO 14155. Um,
Hmm.
be mindful of it as you're designing your clinical studies. Communicate with risk managers
Hmm.
or become risk managers yourself. In some cases, you don't have a choice. You just have to become the risk manager. Take training,
Hmm.
um, learn the language, and know what's expected of a risk investigator from a risk management perspective. There are things you need to do and include in your documentation. So know what those are,
Yeah.
and you really can't do without. It's just it's part of life.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Bijan, for joining us today on the podcast, and I appreciate you taking the time to really communicate this important message to the audience and educating all of us.
My pleasure. Yeah. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode on the Clinical Trial Podcast. Before we say goodbye, I want to share with you a quick story about clinical trial inventory management and a brief message from our sponsor, Slope. Back in 2011, I was managing a complex drug-eluting stent trial. One of the difficult parts of the job was managing medical device inventory at participating clinical trial sites. My team and I had to ensure sites had medical devices on the shelf in order to enroll subjects in the trial. Things became complicated very quickly once we factored in the different stent sizes, the number of sites, the number of countries, the trial duration, and medical device expiration dates. We thought we had a robust inventory management spreadsheet with all the formulae you can imagine. But this spreadsheet wasn't enough. There were still mistakes and errors. Medical products needed to conduct clinical trials are expensive, and you don't need to manage inventory alone. Slope provides an online e-clinical supply chain management platform for sites and sponsors collaborating on complex clinical trials. To learn more about how Slope can help you with your clinical supply management needs, visit slope.io and ask to speak with the solutions coordinator today.
Thank you for listening to the Clinical Trial Podcast. For more exclusive clinical research content to get you to the top of your game, head on over to clinicaltrialpodcast.com.